They were aware that Romulo Betancourt was preparing from Puerto Rico and with the support of the government of a Central American nation, an attack on the life of Citizen General Marcos Pérez Jiménez, President of the Republic, during the commemorative events of the Homeland Week of the current year. Carlos Andrés Pérez coordinated the necessary elements to direct the operation in Venezuela. The controversial government led by General Marcos Pérez Jiménez in Venezuela is remembered among stories of repression, conspiracy, and persecution, and the anecdotes that recall how you could sleep with the doors of the house open due to the level of tranquility in which you lived. Behind these stories, there is an unavoidable character in the collective imagination, Mr. Pedro Estrada Albornoz. In a Venezuela that was undergoing strong social and economic changes, with power in the sights of violent subversive groups, both national and foreign, the role of Pedro Estrada as director of the police intelligence agency called National Security is the most misunderstood and condemned of his entire period. It was Estrada who designed from head to toe in the country the modern police intelligence and counterinsurgency activity during an extremely difficult period for the Venezuelan state, with the start of the Cold War and the internal struggle for power within the nation. A friend of important Latin American presidents trained in the intelligence apparatus of the United States, victorious in Venezuela against the insurgents of the Communist Party and Democratic Action, later condemned, exiled, and detested by the bipartisan democracy, Pedro Estrada was an indispensable actor in a period remembered with mixed feelings of nostalgia and greatness, later accused of the worst crimes and excesses in a stage of development and order. Today we are going to examine the life of Pedro Estrada from the greatest possible objectivity, without the passions that usually cloud historiographical judgment when this topic is addressed. I'm Arnaldo Carrillo, and I invite you to support us by following us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia. Pedro Estrada was born on October 19, 1906 in the town of Wirya, located in the state of Sucre. He was the son of Dolores Olympia Albornoz and Pedro Estrada. His father was an inspector of the liquor tax in Wirya, and his mother was a housewife. The bankruptcy of his father's business forced him to interrupt his schooling in the 6th grade, which is why he never received formal military training. But that adversity served as an opportunity for him to develop new skills that would serve him in the future. He learned to speak English and got a job in the oil companies that were thriving in that booming Venezuela after the eruption of the Barroso's II well. The country was governed since 1908 by General Juan Vicente Gómez. During his long period of governments, numerous warlords unsuccessfully rose against his authority, waving flags of various causes. From an early age, Estrada saw how his relatives and his own father got involved in these revolutions. Growing up in that environment familiarized him early on with weapons, conspiracies, police matters, and clandestine businesses, which inclined him towards that world. In 1929, he embarked on the conspiratorial adventure against the Gómez government, led by General Francisco Gutiérrez, in the uprising that was to coincide with the famous uprising of Roman Delgado Chalbo, known as the Falque. However, the civil chief of Wirya arrested Pedro Estrada and his father and transferred them to Cumana. There they were detained for several months, and through the influence and bribes of his father's smuggling network, they managed to be released and returned to Wirya. With this violent episode, Estrada began his political life in the country. By 1935, with the worsening of the illness of the meritorious Juan Vicente Gómez, a 29-year-old Pedro Estrada, who worked in the treasury of the Sucre state in Cumaná, in a position of little importance, seized the opportunity to move to Maracay after the power vacuum that the transition period implied. The military chief of the Maracay Square, de facto capital city for the purposes of exercising power during the Gómez Mandate, required a police chief, and again influence peddling and cronyism as well as circumstances played in favor of Estrada. He was the ideal candidate to lead the city's police squad, the first position from which he would begin to catapult his governmental career. There he began his work in public order matters. Pedro Estrada's police work in the city of Maracay was, for all intents and purposes, successful in the eyes of Eleazar López Contreras' government. In the midst of a delicate power transition, Estrada mitigated brawls and disturbances, imprisoned dissidents, agitators, and subversives who participated in protests for the continuation of Gomechismo members in the new public administration. Among other actions, Estrada managed to end a demonstration organized by the cells of the Communist Party on February 14, 1936, in an effective and repressive manner. From the fruits of that police investigation, he discovers that elements of the Maracay business sector, which would later group together in the powerful regional employer of Fede Cámaras, financed the activities of communist agitation. In that Venezuela, communist formations already existed, in addition to the subversive activities of multiple groups of all tendencies that, based on Venezuelan history, conceived violence as the main method for the conquest of power. As the chief of police in Maracay, Pedro Estrada reported directly to Isaías Medina Angarita, who at that time held the rank of colonel. From that position, he would begin to ingratiate himself with the military establishment, a matter that would open the doors to power for him and his surroundings. It is pertinent to take into account that at that time intelligence work, that is, the tasks of obtaining, analyzing, and disseminating strategic information for the government's decision-making in matters of national security, were handled in Venezuela by the Secret Service of Investigations, an office with few staff, a score of men at most, very poorly prepared who dressed in civilian clothes. The government decides to dissolve the Secret Service of Investigations and creates the political social section of the governorship of Caracas, which Pedro Estrada, with his brief but effective police work, would go on to direct. Due to his work in favor of public order in Maracay, Estrada managed to attract even more men from the close circle of General López Contreras. So the following year, in 1937, General Elvano Mivelli, then governor of Caracas and a man of extreme trust of López Contreras, called him to direct the political social section of the governorship of Caracas. Now, from Caracas, Estrada would have access to more resources to be able to organize a relatively modern capital police force. This office had the sole mission of political combat, whose expression at that time was to repress any force that sought to overthrow López Contreras. This office was never able to function as a true intelligence organ under the modern cycle of that branch, which consisted of planning, collection, processing, analysis, dissemination, and decision-making. On the contrary, the socio-political section monitored, repressed, and punished the political plans of the underground communist opposition that operated as a criminal gang. Pedro Estrada organized capture groups that went to places where meetings were held, propaganda was printed, and weaponry was stored in order to arrest communist militants and their collaborators. In that sense, it is a mistake to label as spies the unprofessional agents who worked in the socio-political section of Lópezismo, just as it is a mistake to stigmatize as thugs the agents who were more professional than what would be the future national security of Pérez Jiménez. Although we will delve deeper into national security later, it is important to note that this body, created in 1948 and attached to the Ministry of Interior Relations, was made up of public officials properly identified with their badges and with a fixed salary provided by the state. For Venezuelan society, the existence of national security was no secret. When the authorities of this body were involved in some controversy, such as the murder of Leonardo Ruiz Pineda, the National Office of Information and Publications was responsible for informing the public in detail about what happened through press releases, which in turn were reproduced by the newspapers of the time. These agents were not people hired by the government to commit crimes behind the public's back. Therefore, the term henchman is inaccurate and incorrect to categorize these officials by name in posterity. After his stint in the socio-political section of the Caracas governorship, in 1940, Estrada takes over as the deputy director of the Caracas Police Command. There begins the professional training of the police force. He gives them uniforms, develops records of armament parks, organizes shooting range practices, and organizes workshops so that the officers would treat the citizenry with civility. In his passage through that organization, there is a break with the repressive street police of that time, the well-known Chacharos of the Sagrada, a police body that operated during the government of Gomez. In that space, he continues to get closer to the circles of power and continues to consolidate himself as a national reference in the police area. However, by 1944, several differences separated Estrada from President Isaías Medina Angarita. The first is that Medina preferred a military circle over a civilian one, and the other was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's foreign policy decision to ask Latin American governments to make deals with the communists, which is why, being Pedro Estrada one of the most visible faces of insurgency control, and given Medina's pact with the communist and social democratic elements of Venezuela, then hidden in the Progressive Republican Party, Medina then decides to move Estrada to another position. In 1945, a coup d'etat, executed by the armed forces with the support of some members of Democratic Action, overthrows President Isaías Medina Angarita. With the coup, a revolutionary government junta is established in Venezuela, presided over by Rómulo Betancourt. Pedro Estrada was forced to leave the country, making several stops in different places in Central America and the Caribbean islands, where he continues to maintain close communications with Delgado Chalbo and Eleazar López Contreras, informing them of intelligence movements and military counterintelligence and movements of the communist insurgency in Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Panama. During those years, he received support from Dominican President Rafael Leónidas Trujillo, as Estrada was organizing a series of conspiratorial movements to overthrow the new Venezuelan government, established since 1945. Among the conspirators with Estrada from abroad were Luis Jerónimo Pietri, Honorio Sigala, Leonardo Altuve Carrillo, and elements of the Venezuelan aviation and army who organized themselves between Nicaragua and Brazil with Dominican financing that provided them with supplies, weapons, and planes. Given the nature and scope of the conspiratorial movement, Rómulo Betancourt's spies informed the American State Department of the coup intentions. And at the end of 1947, after the election of Rómulo Gallegos, who would only govern for a few months, in the operations center that Estrada and company had set up in Nicaragua, Estrada was arrested along with the others by the National Guard of that country. After this Caribbean tour, Estrada headed to the United States, and there he began a more political role in Washington District of Columbia. In 1948 in Venezuela, the revolutionary junta, led by Acción Democrática, was overthrown in a military coup involving Marcos Pérez Jiménez and new president Carlos Delgado Chalbo. In the U.S., Estrada has contacts with police and financial intelligence services that benefit him personally. It is at this stage when Pedro Estrada begins to acquire a series of advanced knowledge as a diplomatic attaché in the United States, which would later serve him as director of the National Security Directorate in Venezuela. In Washington District of Columbia, Estrada begins to mingle with elements of the American intelligence community. He cultivates relationships that open doors for him to courses with the Federal Bureau of Investigations, both for the convenience of his position and personal interest. This offers him the opportunity to expand his foundations in criminology. He later taught courses to detectives and national security agents. He would also have contacts with elements of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor office of the CIA, with which he would also have annexes. And from it, he would learn research topics in counterinsurgency, interrogation techniques, espionage, among other topics. Perhaps the contribution of the Office of Strategic Services to Estrada's training in aspects of signal interception, such as wiretapping or shortwave radio interception, has been one of the most undervalued. This training allowed Estrada and his team to acquire the necessary knowledge to create a police and national security doctrine in Venezuela a few years later, turning their agency into one of the main producers of modern strategic intelligence and information in a country like Venezuela, where this was a complete novelty. Unlike the British and French intelligence systems, Estrada learned from the Americans to put intelligence analysts and their operatives in the same organization. Likewise, Estrada would improve the capabilities of the confidential information production services in the National Security Directorate by deciphering coded information and dismantling terrorist cells, as well as combating common crime. Finally, the star hour arrives for Pedro Estrada in his homeland. In Venezuela, after the assassination of President Carlos Delgado Chalbot, the same coalition of military and civilians led by Marcos Pérez Jiménez continued to govern. It is essential to bear in mind that despite the 35 years of peace of the Andean hegemony, the use of violence continued to be in Venezuela the preferred method of multiple groups for the conquest of power. So the political difficulties faced by the military government junta in the 50s were not few. The Communist International and the international powers had Venezuela in their sights. From the left, violent cells had formed that were preparing terrorist attacks. In turn, virtually all political parties were conspiring to seize power by force, and within the armed forces there were no shortage of men ready for insurgency. In that context, Pedro Estrada returns to the country to be appointed Director of National Security on August 31, 1951, replacing Jorge Maldonado Perilli. Upon his arrival, he begins to make a series of changes, among them eliminating a British supervision contract held by Scotland Yard for counterinsurgency and political espionage matters. Estrada starts modernizing national security direction. He turns it into a strongly organized body of scientific police with modern police procedures. Procedures for signing, expert opinion, photography, audits, fingerprinting, and files, all this with the help of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. With advice also from private firms in the intelligence sector, Estrada sets up the First Signal's Intelligence Signal Interception Services device, although it was installed in his home instead of the National Security Headquarters, which gave a personalistic character to the interceptions and radio eavesdropping with which he was able to carry out the brilliant anti-subversive campaign that marked a stage of personal security in Venezuela that still resonates today. The National Security Directorate trained officers who carried out police work against conventional crime. It was not just about political matters. Estrada articulated specialized brigades for common crimes and a political brigade with counterinsurgent functions that followed very well the guidelines learned by Estrada in anti-communist matters during his time in Washington, District of Columbia. From the political brigade, agents were trained capable of obtaining information from the clandestine armed resistance through informers and spies, as well as infiltrating the special apparatus of democratic action that was the armed wing of the party led by Alberto Carnevali, who maintained direct communication with Romulo Betancourt. Thanks to this intelligence work, conspiratorial groups, armed cells, coup attempts, and attacks were neutralized during the mandate of General Marcos Pérez Jiménez. In addition to his police work, Estrada knew how to integrate himself very well publicly. Estrada was a tall man who measured 1.82 centimeters and always dressed with fine fashion. He was a cultured, well-educated, and eloquent conversationalist with elegant manners. As a person, he was measured, spoke several languages, and stood out for being skilled in his police work. Estrada made very good relations with the upper echelons of Caracas society, where he was recognized as a polite and respectable man. It is very striking to note that part of the key to the success of national security in defeating the armed resistance on multiple occasions was the disloyalty of those involved in the plots against the government. The denunciations among their own members were valuable material for the organization, which took advantage of the lack of unity among the ranks of Democratic Action to thwart attacks before they were carried out. Not even family ties served as an obstacle for informers when accusing someone before the agents. According to the national security files, brothers, cousins, friends, and those involved in subversive activities did not hesitate to reveal details about their companions. On this lack of loyalty, the Adeco Jorge Dagger, who was close to Leonardo Ruiz Pineda, declared years later in an interview the following: "Almost 90% of the times we failed precisely because of betrayal. It wasn't exactly top-quality people that we had embarked on such difficult tasks that required at a given moment real courage, real bravery for the fight. And that was the fundamental cause of the continuous failures. Hundreds of Venezuelans accused of being involved in subversive activities were sent by national security to prisons like Huasina, from which testimonies of mistreatment and torture to obtain information emerged. On the other hand, many of the accusations of murder and disappearances were never proven in court in the trials that were held later. The truth is that thanks to the propaganda apparatus of Pérez Jiménez's opponents, during and after his term, the repressive work of the National Security Directorate was greatly exaggerated. Certainly during this time there were political prisoners, there were excesses and limitations on freedom of association, as there were in previous periods and in subsequent periods of bipartisan democracy, even on a larger scale, in a country where, unfortunately, state violence as a mechanism to guarantee order and security has always been the norm. But it should be noted, as is well documented, that the majority of those persecuted by the military government of the 50s were individuals who were shown to be linked to armed insurrection activities. Since 1949, Democratic Action, along with other left-wing elements, attempted to carry out at least 7 coups during that period. Despite constant attempts to overthrow the government, Pérez Jiménez closed the Huasina prison in 1952, released hundreds of political prisoners throughout his term, and authorized a visa for the return of all exiles in 1956, including Romulo de Tancourt and Romulo Gallegos. Likewise, many of the murders and tortures that Piancrez Gemocnez and his closest circle have been accused of were never proven in the Venezuelan courts. Numerous national security officials were acquitted, and of the 23 former officials who were sentenced years later, more than half were found guilty for their involvement with the murder of Wilfrido Omaña, an army captain who had attempted a coup in 1952, who continued to conspire in secret, and who was ambushed by numerous national security officials. Faced with the inactivity of his party, whose membership was demoralized by the constant subversive failures, Horatio Chacon Ducharme, a dangerous Adeco with a reputation for conjuring in the region, prepared an attack under the name of Operation Benoni with the aim of assassinating Pedro Estrada. However, like previous attempts by the Democratic Action, the attack was thwarted thanks to the work of the national security. Years later, Chacon Ducharme said the following: "In my opinion, Pedro Estrada was not a bandit. He simply defended a government in which he believed, while I defended my principles. I didn't expect mercy from him because I was also ready to shoot him. But if I met him today, I would have no problem greeting him. Many people, especially cowards, can't understand this." The National Security Directorate continued to grow in its duties until 1956, a year by which repressive actions were practically unnecessary, as almost all traces of subversive activity in Venezuela were virtually dismantled thanks to the work led by Pedro Estrada. The regularity of investigations, raids, and arrests decreased to such an extent that by 1958 there were only 380 detainees for political reasons in Venezuelan cells. National security practically did not have to invest in campaigns to work on the reputation that had been formed of them in the population. On one hand, the work of crime prevention was extremely effective. On the other hand, efforts to mitigate insurgency and political terrorism were noteworthy, and ultimately the government of Pérez Jiménez capitalized on the prestige and fear it inspired in its political adversaries. However, one of the weaknesses that Estrada himself recognized was the absence of a governmental apparatus that, from the civil and educational sphere, would contribute to the fight against the insurgency of the left beyond traditional police work. It is very important to note that despite the police rigor of his position, Pedro Estrada's career as Director of National Security was as much public relations as administrative politics. And thanks to this, he earned the rivalry, resentment, and in some cases the friendship of some elements of the military world surrounding President Marcos Pérez Jiménez, who was constantly the object of both respect and flattery and hypocrisy. We must remember that in addition to the deep anti-communist street activity of the National Security Directorate, there was also the intelligence service to the armed force that operated in parallel. And this did not function with the same efficiency in its counterintelligence work when it came to mitigating conspiratorial activities within the armed forces, from where precisely the movement that overthrew Pérez Jiménez originated. In such a way, the flatterers of Pérez Jiménez's military circle often provided him with information about the novelties of the barracks and about the alleged excesses of Pedro Estrada, often decorated with hyperboles that General Pérez Jiménez himself did not believe. Information that years later, when internal conspiracies in the armed forces intensified, pushed Pérez Jiménez to have to dismiss Pedro Estrada in January of 1958 and replace him with a character who would secretly be linked to the subversive movement that would overthrow the government. Pérez Jiménez trusted in the military testament, despite the rumors of a conspiracy looming against him by December 10th of 1957, rumors of which Estrada warned him, echoing his informants in the armed forces. Pérez Jiménez did not pay attention to these rumors, and this mistake marked the beginning of his eventual downfall. Marcos Pérez Jiménez informed Pedro Estrada of his intentions to replace him with Army Colonel Luis Teófilo Velasco, who was secretly involved in the military conspiracy to overthrow the current government. But thanks to the military flattery that characterized General Pérez Jiménez's circle, he became myopic and deaf to the warnings of his most loyal intelligence officer, Mr. Pedro Estrada. In the midst of the conspiracy against the government on January 9, 1958, Estrada decides to remove the bulk of the files he had in the Directorate and takes them with him. In addition to this, he moves his family to the embassy of the Dominican Republic. At that embassy, he negotiates with the authorities of that country, accredited in Caracas, to provide shelter for his family, and decides to organize arrangements to board a flight from La Carlota Airport. Meanwhile, Colonel Luis Teófilo Velasco had already taken over national security and was taking command of that direction with his troops. Ready to kill Estrada, as part of the conspiracy against Pérez Jiménez, he decides to militarize the airport, and after a strong struggle, Estrada and his family managed to board an aircraft, thanks to the mediation of the Dominican ambassador and Colonel Victor Maldonado Michelena, personally sent by Pérez Jiménez to ensure Estrada's departure. This partly demonstrated the already evident cracking of the government's security apparatus, an incipient shadow of what was looming over the general. One of the problems with the government of Marcos Pérez Jiménez was that his administration could not create an officialdom capable of giving him a long-term institutional support base, as personalism and caudillismo had always been the real law in that Venezuelan society. The hasty departure of the Director of National Security to the Dominican Republic with his family did not fail to astonish the American diplomatic personnel, who in a cable to the embassy in Washington, District of Columbia, expressed just 3 days from January 23, 1958, that Marcos Pérez Jiménez was, quote, interested in reasserting his authority in the face of the circulation of anti-government manifestos and strong rumors of oil strikes, which is why he had dismissed Colonel Luis Teófilo Velasco to reinstall Pedro Estrada. And indeed, Pedro Estrada was called back to the position several times, but he could never return, as his return flight was scheduled for January 23rd, and elements of his circle of American informants persuaded him not to return in the face of the imminent fall of the regime. On his part, in the Dominican Republic, President Rafael Leonidas Trujillo wishes to put him to work under his command, preparing Pedro Estrada to take over and manage an intelligence office and to articulate a team similar to the one he had in Venezuela. But Estrada rejected the offer out of loyalty to Venezuelan internal affairs, as he did not want to jeopardize issues of national internal order from which the Dominican regime could take geopolitical advantage, given the incipient rise of social democracy in Venezuela. The truth is that Estrada's stay in the Dominican Republic would be uncomfortable for both him and his hosts, because his predecessor in the National Security Directorate, Jorge Maldonado Perilli, whose sympathies with Venezuelan social democracy were always impossible for him to hide, as well as the resentment that Estrada had taken his position, took on the task of reporting to the Dominican intelligence chief about Pedro Estrada's plans to leave for the United States to meet there with Marcos Pérez Jiménez and obtain a series of credentials in his passport that would allow them to travel to other parts of the world to escape the extradition orders that were being issued from Venezuela against him. Through a friend of Estrada's in the State Department, who warned him that the United States would eventually make a pact with the Venezuelan government to extradite Pérez Jiménez and his ringleaders, Pedro Estrada and his family had to flee from Miami Beach to Spain. With this information, Estrada attests that his enemies and those of Pérez Jiménez went beyond the political left. His trip to Spain would initiate a European journey marked by constant diplomatic international pressures exerted by Caracas towards the different places where he and his family tried to set foot. After Pérez Jiménez, Estrada was the figure that Venezuelan democracy feared the most and most wanted to neutralize abroad, so this story was far from over for Estrada. Estrada's first stop would be in Madrid, where under pressure from the former general commander of the Air Force of the Pérez Jiménez government, who had become ambassador of the new government that had been installed in Venezuela, and pressures from Fernando María Castiella, foreign minister of Generalissimo Francisco Franco, they pressured him to leave the country. Despite the warning, Estrada does not leave the country immediately, as he first makes a pact with Carlos Arias Navarro, who was serving as director of security, and puts him in contact with the Minister of Interior of Francoism, General Camilo Alonso Vega. He assured him that the Spanish government would not extradite him. But Estrada, aware of the bilateral relations between Venezuela and Spain, as well as the large presence of immigrants in his homeland, did not want to jeopardize the stability of these links by his presence, so he embarked for Switzerland. In Switzerland, he seeks to meet with some Venezuelan collaborators, but is arrested by orders of the police of that country, who are acting under pressures from the Venezuelan diplomatic headquarters, which based its arguments to arrest him on pamphlets that emerged from the subversive presses of the Special Apparatus of Democratic Action and the Communist Party in Venezuela in the times of the dictatorship. Astutely, Pedro Estrada manages to convince the Swiss that he was a former high-ranking official of the Piangues-Gemocne government, so they leave him alone, at least for the remainder of the year 1958. Estrada spends Christmas and New Year's Eve with his family in Switzerland, but again they were harassed by the Swiss authorities at the request of Caracas, so they now depart for England. In London, a former persecuted and imprisoned by the National Security, who had received a benefit of freedom from Pedro Estrada, organized student demonstrations with elements of the radical left, the Labor Party, the Communists, and the infiltrators of the Communist International in front of the hotel where Pedro Estrada and his family were staying, attracting the attention of the British intelligence services, who put him on alert and let him know the discomfort his presence causes in that city. All of this, coupled with the diplomatic pressures from Venezuela, made Estrada have to embark again with his family, this time towards France. After arriving in Paris, Estrada settled in a house in the 8th district, diagonal to the Arc de Triomphe. Venezuelans involved in politics would pass through his house, and he always handled, until the end of his days, information that he shared with the security elements of Venezuela that he cultivated throughout all his years. In his Parisian exile, he was characterized by opening the door, as he always did in Venezuela, to anyone who rang the bell. He befriended elements linked to intelligence firms and private security firms and consultancies, not before being arrested by the French gendarmerie, transferred to the General Police Station, and interrogated by the head of Interpol for France, who then released him after reviewing his documents, listening to his versions, and understanding that Estrada was a valuable member of the Western intelligence community who had worked with the United States Office of Special Services, with the CIA, with the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and with other police agencies. This is how Pedro Estrada finally obtains asylum in France, much to the chagrin of the Venezuelan government that had spent a huge amount of diplomatic resources to finance the extradition of Marcos Pérez Jiménez and Pedro Estrada, as well as to dismantle the intelligence apparatus of national security, seek to prosecute its agents and condemn them. Some of the former officials of national security were re-engaged in the new police intelligence apparatus of the Democratic Action governments, known as General Police Directorate, the General Police Directorate. One of the biggest ongoing questions about national security is what happened to its valuable archive. However, it is a topic that historians have devoted very little time to, so to this day the public only knows a few pages that survived the passage of time and the censorship of subsequent governments. And since these files were treated with little care since the fall of Pérez Jiménez, as well as the agency's dependencies were looted and burned by the crowd, most people have assumed that these were consumed by the fire. Well, 6 decades later, this issue deserves to be addressed. Months after the fall of Pérez Jiménez, an incident occurred that would be unknown to this day if the press of the time had not documented it. In November of 1958, when Edgar Zanabria was already presiding over the government board, urban cleaning workers transported between 20,000 and 30,000 files and cards of the national security to incinerate them in the car crematorium ovens using vehicles of the armed forces. The intention was to completely erase the intelligence work that had been recorded from that agency. But they only managed to burn 1,000 files because the President of the Republic ordered the head of the Armed Forces Intelligence Service to stop the process. The political parties had signed a document committing them to review the files to understand how national security worked. As argued by Eduardo Gallegos Mancera, the federal district councilor for the Communist Party, who managed the suspension of the act. For its part, the Ministry of Defense published a statement announcing that the incineration would be postponed because the Commission of the Ministry of Interior Relations, made up of representatives from the political parties, had not yet submitted a report in relation to the files. This means that the national security files, which for decades were believed to have been consumed by fire, actually ended up in the hands of the main political parties, who have remained absolutely silent for decades. So these parties are the only ones responsible that Venezuelans still do not know the high historical value information that is in these documents. Pedro Estrada dies on August 11, 1989 in Paris at the age of 82. His legacy was to have laid the foundations for the creation of a professionalized police body with modern investigative techniques for forensic and crime-fighting purposes, as well as having created the first modern intelligence institution of the 20th century in Venezuela, whose functions were really useful from an organizational and institutional point of view to support the stability of a government constituted in a time of great threats to the country. Like every man, his actions were plagued with mistakes, one of these being the personalistic character with which he led the institution in a context where his superiors were military. Similarly, Estrada's inability to identify the members of the Patriotic Board, including Fabricio Ojeda, a conspirator who frequented the Miraflores Palace, was one of the elements that marked the end of the government. Estrada himself acknowledges that his great mistake as Director of National Security was not knowing how to combat the subversion of the left with procedures complementary to the repressive ones, by not having had the resources available to carry out a policy capable of combating communism and insurgents from an educational and ideological field, which was precisely the area where the Venezuelan left knew best how to operate. Pedro Estrada was a man worthy of his times, born in the era of the remnants of the Montoneros. He had to live in a century plagued by conflicts and historical inflections, where Venezuela came to have a geopolitical relevance that few South American nations have had. For he managed to keep the ambitions of the international communist in check, working for multiple military governments as a civilian. He knew how to navigate the climate of conspiracies. We must remember that he received the position of Director of Intelligence of an institution that did not exist, for which he had to train and bring with him the burdens of the Venezuelan system in which he had to toughen up, a system whose common denominator was repressive violence. In this context, Estrada created a Nobel intelligence system with modern techniques that complemented old vices. Until the last day of his life, Pedro Estrada took responsibility for his actions. And about the historical judgment that was made of him in posterity, he commented in an interview decades later, "We must review with true rigor the handling of information about this phenomenon by the current democratic order. It is evident that today's democracy cannot accept the degree of repressive action it has been forced to develop over these 25 years. The dictatorship, repression, torture, security binomial cannot be easily broken, so democracy seeks a way to justify its dead, tortured, and disappeared as a necessary evil of a society that requires guaranteeing its stability. A bit as if democracy represses because it has no other choice, while dictatorship does it because it feels a secret voice in carrying out an action inherent to itself. It is not possible in historical terms to accept these binomials. Democracy, for its own justification, has intentionally built a strong ideological charge aimed at giving a kind of irrevocable verdict on the Pérez Jiménez dictatorship. It obeys clear ideopolitical and doctrinal interests, and this has shaped a practice that has manifested in a collective consciousness. This was the life of Pedro Estrada. Thanks for watching this documentary. I invite you to leave your comments, to leave your likes, to subscribe to the channel, and above all, to share this video with everyone. I also invite you to follow us on our Instagram account, The New Encyclopedia, and watch all the videos on this channel that you're sure to love. Thank you very much to everyone, and see you in a next delivery.